everyone, and welcome to the Q&A. Today I am joined by the editor of Fidelity Press and Culture Wars, and the author of many great books, including Barren Metal and Libido Dominandi, which is a book that I particularly enjoyed. E. Michael Jones. Say hello, E. Michael.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Excellent, yeah. So, what I wanted to do with this interview, because of course there's a lot of controversy going on, and I'm sure that, and I've seen many sort of interviews follow the same kind of track of discussing that. One thing that I noticed is that, particularly reading Libido Dominandi, is that there's a lot of practical wisdom to be found in your work. And I was wondering if you could, answer a few questions indeed from my audience and go over that with us. So, with regards to Libido Dominandi, I found it very interesting what you had to say about Adam Weishaupt in the beginning. So I was wondering if you could give a summary of that, because I think that really establishes the concept that you tried to push.
Yeah, over the course of the 18th century, the Masonic lodges got weaponized by the Whig Party. Newton's protege, Desaguliers, was a Huguenot who was the crucial link between Newtonian physics and the Freemasons. And over this period of time, they used Newtonian physics as a way of just basically stating the English were in touch with ultimate reality, and you need to listen to the English if you want to know about ultimate reality. And they started then spreading these Masonic lodges to the continent, specifically to France, because England was engaged in a war with France over who was going to rule the world. So they set up these Masonic lodges in Holland, then in France, and they used the post office in Holland to send subversive material into France. During this period of time, there was a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt, who was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany, in Bavaria. And he began to see that the effectiveness of the Masonic lodges. And he decided he was going to do something even more powerful than the Masonic lodges. And the reason this was more powerful was because it was based on Catholic theology, specifically the examination of conscience. So he was going to turn the examination of conscience upside down. So normally you would go to your confessor and you'd say, confess your sins, and they would discuss strategies to basically overcome the sins, which means getting your passions under rational control. Weishaupt turned the whole thing upside down. So instead of, he did go into the some type of discussion of the faults of the people who were under his control in these newly weaponized Masonic lodges. The group was called the Illuminati. It is a real group. And he would use this as a way of controlling them. So instead of saying, I committed this sin, I'm sorry, and the priest says, I absolve you from your sins, go and sin no more, the controller would say, take note of the sin, and then he would foster this sin, because he knew that the sin was a form that sin was basically slavery. It was a form of slavery. Every man, as Augustine said, has as many masters as he had vices. And so if you want to be free, you have to basically avoid vice. But if you want to control people, if you want to enslave them, then you promote vice. And this was the genius, the evil genius behind Adam Weishaupt's merger of, let's say, the concept of the Masonic Lodge and the concept of the examination of conscience.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I'm not sure if you agree, but growing up in the UK, which is obviously incredibly secular, I've seen this inversion as kind of the norm. Vice is everywhere, and people are controlled by them, and I certainly seek to potentially reverse that, because I've seen the effects of that. So what I was going to ask is, of course, are there any ways that you would see that we could go about, obviously aside from becoming Catholic, because this is what my channel promotes, practical means of overcoming things like, especially pornography. As you spoke about the Second Intifada in the introduction of the book, I believe. Other things like drugs and alcohol. Is there anything that you'd say specifically on that?
Yeah, I mean, what your generation has to wake up to the fact that everything that is described as liberation is in fact a form of control. That's a simple fact of life growing up in this world today. And most of these forms of liberation are centered around sexuality. And what you're seeing is the promotion of a systematic promotion of vice as a form of control. It comes in various forms. One of the main forms is feminism, and feminism is promoted as a way of managing guilt, specifically guilt over abortion. We have this Canadian lady by the name of Atwood, who wrote a book called The Handmaid's Tale, and now this is caught on with all of the ladies out there who have killed their offspring and now feel guilty about it. So you'll have this group of people who will basically exist to manage guilt. Everyone is going to have to wake up to the fact that that's why feminism is there. Okay, it's a political mobilization of guilt. Now, what you realize then is if there's no guilt, there's no manipulation. There's no power of manipulation. So if you want to be free from manipulation, you have to get rid of the guilt. Well, how do you get rid of the guilt? Well, this is an old question, and Jesus Christ had the answer to it, and it is institutionalized as a sacrament in the Catholic Church, and it's known as the sacrament of confession. So basically, Jesus Christ has the power to free you from your sins. People don't talk about that, but it's one of the most basic issues, political issues in the world today. So if you're awake to the fact that, yes, I'm tormented by guilt for things that I've done, I'm being manipulated by people who understand that, you have to deal with the problem of guilt, and there's only one way you can deal with it. It's Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church. So we have a series of steps here that you have to go through. You have to understand that you're a slave. You're enslaved to your passions. You have to understand that the people who got you into that are your enemies and want to destroy you. You have to realize that there is a way out of that, and that this is the way out, the way I've described. It's Jesus Christ and the church you found.
Yeah, I have to say, I converted to Catholicism around 2 years ago from a background which is as Anglo as you can basically get. Like a Freemasons in the background and also Anglicans. So, and I spent a good 2 weeks working through a detailed examination of conscience and produced about 20 pages worth of sins that I've committed. And it was a real process, but I not only lost the guilt, but of course I obtained that grace by admitting that. And I'd suggest that everyone else do that. But one thing that I heard that I think may be pertinent is that something like 25% of women have had abortions in the West. So it's like 1 in 4. And so, of course, that's given feminism quite a lot of strength, I think.
That's right. And you can see it in a place like Ireland. This downturn in Ireland is largely the political mobilization of this downturn was kind of shocking to everyone when they had these referenda. But the problem begins when you allow the sexual subversion of your culture. And that's beginning in our lifetimes. It was in the 60s. I watched it happen. I watched it happen in my life. I saw people just swept away by it. And over the past 50 years, it's been institutionalized. There are institutions that basically promote this type of enslavement. And the Irish were just caught unawares by the whole thing. They were just not up to speed. In many ways, I have to say this, the Catholic Church is not up to speed. The Catholic Church does not understand psychological warfare. Now, if by that I mean the systematic subversion of morals as a way of taking political power. I say this because there are plenty of people, seminarians, who will contact me and they'll say, I read your book. But what they say next is, I'm not allowed to say it. You're banned. You're banned from the seminary.
Verboten.
This is the problem here. The guy. I've come up with an explanation that the seminarians find plausible, but the people who control the seminaries will not allow it as part of the official discourse, and that's the crisis in the Catholic Church, because you've got a lot of people who are in the church who are committed sexual revolutionaries. The crucial problem is homosexuality, because the heterosexuals who decided that the priest who fell in love with the nun, if they want to get married, you got to leave the church. And so what happened is you concentrated the homosexuals within the church, and they became a force within the church that is basically blocking the spread of consciousness. By consciousness, I mean a true understanding of the history, what really happened in the period following 1965, and the mechanisms that got used to basically destroy the church. That still hasn't happened, and that's a problem. That's one of the main problems with the Catholic Church right now. The Catholic Church is basically handing out muskets in the seminaries so that these new priests can go out and shoot down F-16s with their muskets. It's not going to work. You have to understand what's going on. You have to understand who is doing it. There are definite people, and this is the next roadblock that you come across, because you have this understanding of the Jews as our friends, our elder brothers in the faith, that is completely contrary to the actual historical facts of what happened from 1965 to the present. This group has been in leadership role in pornography, in gay marriage, in every subversive movement in this time period, and the church is still living out this fantasy of their interpretation of Nostra Aetate as the Jews as our elder brothers. It's had a catastrophic effect on the church's ability to defend the moral law. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that I can't speak, of course, for influences. I don't know enough, but I know of seminary professors who who have spoken to a certain extent about this kind of thing, but of course it's not a correct thing to speak about. But the real reason that I'm the thing is that the reason I brought up the vices and the sexual revolution, and I'm glad that you talked about Ireland and abortions, is that you said in one of your interviews something along the lines of, when you're in your 20s, you need to find somebody who you should marry, right? I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the time to do it.
Yeah. Now, the thing is that there are a lot of men, particularly on my channel and all over the internet, not necessarily politically involved, that are in such a position that the sexual revolution has turned these women, I think that it turned them into people who aren't exactly good prospects, like to paraphrase Solomon in the Proverbs, their feet go down to hell and they do not walk along the path of life. And of course, we being young, of course after growing up, many of us grew up without fathers, many of us grew up with weak fathers. We don't know where we stand as well. So I was wondering, because of course you obviously have a lot of context with the Bible. You've studied it, no doubt, more than I have, and with all of the historical context, I was wondering if there was any wisdom that you would provide to that sort of pursuit, because as far as I understand, there's going to be no stability in society before we start to rebuild the family, because as Aristotle said, the family is the bedrock of the society.
Right. Yes. What is it that makes you attractive? Obviously we have bodies, obviously if you're disfigured or something or other, you're not going to be attractive to a member of the opposite sex. But that's not the case with most people. And for most people, it's the mind that makes you attractive, because whenever you meet someone of the opposite sex, the first thing you start doing is talking. And at that point, you provide a window to your soul of what you're really like. And at a certain point, even if you're Cyrano de Bergerac and you have this big nose, the woman's going to say, this guy's interesting to talk to, and she's going to forget about the fact that you're Cyrano de Bergerac. And that's what has to happen here. So the beginning of what I'm talking about in the relation between the sexes is logos. It's speech. And you get together and you talk with a woman. Now, let's go cut to the chase here. What is the main prohibition against speech between the sexes? It's smartphones. Let's face it. What these things do is prevent you from being with the person you are with. So I was standing in line at a restaurant in New York City, and there's behind me is an attractive-looking young man and an attractive-looking young woman. They're about 6 inches apart. And what are they doing? They're both looking at their cell phones. They're completely cut off from each other. So this is part of the problem here. Technological problem. Okay? The other issue here. What do I mean by logos? By logos, I mean the understanding of the universe. That means your understanding of where you stand in the universe. The thing that for people of your age, the main problem with people who are in their 20s is sexual passion. Sexual passion darkens the mind. Sexual passion, if you follow it without reason, it will lead you to a position of isolation. And the isolation right now is symbolized best by internet pornography and masturbation. That will completely cut you off from the opposite sex and make you a very unattractive person. So my theory is, what I'm proposing here is, if you take control of your passions, your mind will open up and your mind will start to see things that it did not see before. And once your mind starts to perceive this reality, you will want to share it with someone. And most likely you will want to share it with a member of the opposite sex. And so even if that young lady standing next to you is a sex robot and a wage slave, which is what she was trained to be, which is another word for feminism, she's still a human being. And you can still strike up a conversation with her if you take her cell phone and smash it on the... No, don't do that. Don't do that. You may want to do that, but I mean, basically, if you can actually engage in a conversation with your mind now freed from passion, you will become an attractive person and women will want to be with you. And at that point, you will find someone and then you will be able to get married. So this is the recipe for a successful life, according to E. Michael Jones, okay? And also clean up your room, okay? Do that too.
Yeah, wash your penis, I suppose. Yeah, I can speak from experience with that. Like, I dropped that habit by the grace of God, and honestly, a lot of reading of Libido Dominandi, that I realised quite what it was. And I've noticed that, there's, people nowadays, they use people and they love things, whereas you begin to love people and use things when you've dropped that. And, I mean, women notice that. I can speak from experience in that. But, and I've made a lot of content to that extent. I do think that men should be, men should definitely drop that kind of thing. I mean, I think Rush V has talked about this at length. But
he's a good example of what I'm talking about. I mean, this is a man who is like the Don Juan of our age, 1,003 in Spain alone. And yet he felt that it was unsatisfying, and he's moved on, and he's starting to talk about logos now. This is the type of conversion that is taking place within your cohort, within your generation. There are all sorts of people who are just dying to hear this type of information. And when they hear it, they'll be grateful to you. And maybe if it's a woman, she'll fall in love with you because you had this to say. That's a prospect. That's a very definite prospect right now.
Yeah. I mean, the aim of what I'm trying to do here, because I read the Saints as much as I can, because people they don't know about, say, I don't know, St. John Climacus's Ladder of Divine Ascent, is that I try and break that down for people so that they can learn from that, because I've noticed not many people are really doing that. Like, not all people have the patience or the knowledge to sit through someone like Father Chad Ripperger talk about it, who's incredible as well. But the trouble is, I think most men will externalize in the way they look at things. I'd actually like to hear your opinion on this. Do you think that there's too much externalization going on with our culture, and that there needs to be a return to looking within ourselves? Or
What do you mean by externalization? What do you mean by that?
so you have a lot of political protests going on in Britain with freedom of speech. I was at a few with like Salafis facing off against the more nationalist types, and the one thing that I've noticed is that the people who are involved in these sorts of things, they think that they can solve some sort of external problem and they'll be happy. And this doesn't strike me as true after a lot of reflection. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on it, though.
Well, the polis, the state, is the macrocosm of the soul, which is the microcosm. So if your soul is disordered, then you will end up with a disordered state. If your soul is disordered, you will flee from yourself, because you'll hate yourself, and you'll hate the disorder. And one of the ways to flee from yourself is to project your disorder onto other people, and that's known as politics. So there's always going to be a form of disorder being projected onto the world, and the more people they have, the more political power they have. But I'm saying that there's a healthy version of that, which is basically, once you know the truth, you want to share the truth with other people. And people who recognize that you understand what is true will want to listen to you. And so that is the opposite of that, what you're calling externalization, if I understand you. Let's be perfectly clear. What are women protesting in favor of abortion really talking about? They're talking about the fact that they are crippled with guilt because they killed their own child. I mean, it's hard to imagine something more heinous than killing your own child. Someone completely vulnerable, completely dependent upon you for everything, including life, and you turned on that person and killed him because for your career or some stupid, selfish reason. They're crippled with guilt. And so you have to understand the psychological dynamic behind that, and you have to be able to address it.
It's like, I observe that, of course, in left-wing movements. I think that's very evident with them. Perhaps looking from the outside, that's why. But I also see it to an extent with more right-wing movements. Like, I'm entirely apolitical at this point. I was involved with other political parties in the past, but I've just renounced that entirely now. And I wondered if you saw a similar thing, perhaps with the right-wingers in Britain who are talking about freedom of speech constantly, because I get the distinct impression, having been around them for quite a long time, that they think that freedom of speech will just solve all of their problems. A lot of them, anyway. Obviously, like, there's a real reason for sustaining that freedom of speech. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, freedom of speech is one of the crucial issues of our age. But if you speak English and you have some idea of what traditional values are, you invariably end up in some type of acceptable speech known as conservatism. And conservatism will invariably accept more of the premises that the culture is promoting than they should. And that was the whole problem in America. Conservatism had this moment. It's dead now. It pretty much died. It was an acceptable way of engaging in discourse after World War II. And it replaced an unacceptable conservatism, which was basically America First, which wanted to keep America out of the war, and which all of the leaders of that group were demonized as anti-Semites. Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, and Charles Lindbergh. The situation in England is complicated by the fact that what you're seeing is basically the last gasp of the state church. What you're witnessing now in England and the Scandinavian countries is the final gasp of Protestantism. Now, Protestantism, because it was a state church, had a kind of power because the state was behind it. So you had this kind of merger of what I've called the English ideology, a kind of powerful coming together of a lot of different forces, like Newtonian physics, like the Masonic Lodge, like Presbyterianism, capitalism, empire, and culture, a kind of culture that unified all these things to the point where you had a group of people who just lived and breathed the same air with each other, like the plays of Oscar Wilde. I mean, it's just like shared culture here. That's part of why it's so funny, because everybody knows what the shared culture is, and they all accept it. And then it broke down. It broke down completely. Virginia Woolf said it collapsed in 1910. And she certainly helped it collapse. The Bloomsbury crowd, all the subversive, the homosexuals like Lytton Strachey, promoters of the higher sodomy, as they called it, basically had a devastating effect on English culture. And then they infected the church, and now the church has evaporated as a force, and people are looking around for alternatives. I mean, this superstructure has collapsed, so what is an Englishman going to do? Well, in my personal experience, if you're a man, you become a white nationalist. And if you're a woman, you become a Muslim. And that's what I see, this vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. And so what you're seeing is the rise of these two antithetical operations in England at the time. And the problem here is that one feeds off the other. In other words, the more women become Muslims, the more the men become annoyed and become more and more white nationalists against immigration. I don't know whether you've seen it. I think it's still up on YouTube, but I gave this speech to the London Forum. Jez Turner invited me there. Jez Turner sent this.
No, I haven't.
It's worth watching, because I just stepped into it. Was like right after Brexit had gone through. Everybody is kind of feeling strong, and they're all feeling strong because they're white guys. You know, we white guys have to stick together. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not white. I'm biracial. I'm Irish and German. And to be honest with you, I don't think you're white either. I think you're English. I think you're an English Protestant who doesn't go to church anymore. And because of that, you have no roots, and you don't even know where to look. And so suddenly you have this white identity that's just going to take you nowhere.
I mean, so the thing is, yeah, I agree. Like, I see this amongst my friends groups, because at universities, there's, of course, like, you know, the kind of men who will just, you know, suck up to the current secular culture, but there are a lot who won't. And they're, like you say, being led into white nationalism and into being edgy for the sake of being edgy. The trouble is, though, is that they live disordered lives, and they allow that their passions to control them. And, I mean, it honestly seems like something straight out of the book of Jeremiah or something like that, just the way that these people live. And the only ordered force at the moment, aside from the Catholic Church in Britain, which is largely composed of immigrants, and while organised, doesn't have the same vitality as Islam, which I think is the vitalistic force at the moment. I'm not sure what you think on that. Exactly.
I think that England was Catholic for 900 years before the Reformation. I think there is an English character that was distorted by the Reformation. The Reformation was a looting operation. That's all it was. And then the looters needed some way to defend their theft. And so they came up with Protestantism. English Protestantism is basically defense of looting. And it turns out that some of the biggest defenders of the English ideology have roots in the looters. Bertrand Russell, a good example. Okay. These people created something that had lived for a time, and it died. And now I'm saying, okay, I see the two options that are there. I see Islam on the one side. All of these ladies who led disordered lives now have the tyrant come in and tell them, put on the hijab. I've talked to these ladies, you know, I understand what you're doing. I understand the white guys, why they're upset. I'm saying Catholicism is the real alternative, because that's what England was. In a sense, Catholicism created England in the same way that Catholicism created Germany. I've said it before, but, you know, if it weren't for Catholicism, my Germans would be chasing pigs through the forest, because that's what they did. This outraged the white guys, but I said the only difference between Africa and Europe, the only difference between the Diocese of Mbinga in Tanzania and the Diocese of Würzburg in Germany is 1,200 years of Catholic culture, unbroken Catholic culture in Germany, which taught the Germans how to work, because the Benedictines' motto is ora et labora, and because labor is the source of all value, they became a wealthy country because of Catholicism. It's the only explanation. And I'm saying, we can't go back. We can't go back to the days of Lord Nelson and Isaac Newton and whoever else you want to go back to. You can't go back. You can only go forward, and the way forward is Logos. And the vehicle for Logos in human history is the Catholic Church. And any group that succeeded in history because they took some of that patrimony of Logos out of the Catholic Church and they ran with it until it evaporated. And that's what we're seeing now with the Protestant countries in Europe, especially England.
Actually, that leads me on to a couple of questions, because from my audience I've got a number of questions, and I got one off of a guy called Benedict, because within our community, this sort of Discord community, we try to explain theology, Catholic theology, to the average person in order to, you know, just like get them away from these kind of self-destructive ideologies like Islam and like white nationalism. And he asked, how would be the best way to go about explaining Logos to women who have been absolutely trapped by this feminist culture that's enslaved them utterly?
Well, I suppose you would start with the Logos of the human body and say everything has a Logos because it was created by God, and there's a plan here. And why are you unhappy, honey? You're unhappy because you made decisions that did not follow the Logos of the human body. So, for example, the human female is fertile, and sexual activity between male and female leads to procreation, to children. If you decided to do this in a moment of passion and found yourself pregnant outside of marriage, then the culture will promote abortion. And the fastest way to wreck your life is to have an abortion. I guarantee it. Okay? There is a chance you can repent, but that means you have to go completely away from the dominant culture and go to the Catholic Church, because that is the only agency that will provide a release from guilt. Every other agency will give you a political ideology or drugs or alcohol or some type of other to numb the pain, but they cannot get to the heart of the matter. So I would begin with the Logos of the body and then take it out from there. If you want some detailed explanation of how the perversion of that Logos works, read Libido Dominandi, because that's how it got turned into a form of control. So if you use this properly, you will create a world for yourself. You will have other people coming into this world, and the family will exist to protect everyone in that family from these pernicious influences. And you will not end up as the woman that I met in this, didn't meet her, but sat next to her on a park bench in New York City, in Greenwich Village, Washington Square. And she was telling the younger woman that she woke up at midnight or she didn't wake up. She was sitting on her sofa eating her cheese sandwich at midnight. And she realized, I don't have any friends. I don't have any children. I don't have a family. I don't have anything except that job at the law firm, which is exploiting me to death. Now, that's the choice that's in front of you. And it generally, the fork in the road is how you use sexuality. You can use it as a kind of entertainment device, and you'll end up like the sex robot wage slave that working for that law firm. Or you can affirm the Logos of sexuality, which involves procreation, and form a family. And at that point, you won't be eating a cheese sandwich by yourself on the sofa at midnight. You'll be nursing a baby on the sofa at midnight. Okay, which is a much better use of your time. That choice. I think you should confront these young ladies. What young lady I wish they were here now. I don't know. What's she going to say?
I mean, I must admit, one of the most wholesome things I see when I go to Eucharistic adoration is there's this Sri Lankan family with 5 children, and the parents are some of the happiest people I've ever seen. These little ones who are like Eucharistic, like altar servers and things like that. And this kind of leads on to another question from, let me see where the name is, Philip. And of course there's the institution of marriage that would come out of that by nature. That's just natural law. But in light of that, in addition to what you were saying about the Benedictines earlier on in the interview, and of course you wrote that short book about it, are there any institutions that lay people could create in the modern world to simulate the effect that the Benedictine monasteries had on Germany during that intense period of evangelization?
The fundamental institution that is the parish. That's the it's a geographical entity. Okay, you will meet people from your community in that geographical area by going to that church. Now, whether the parish is vibrant or dull depends on the people in it. And so in a sense, it's up to the people to create the organizations that address the issues in their day. Now, I proposed a League of St. Benedict after I wrote the book, The Slaughter of Cities, because I understood at that point that there were these inner city parishes in the United States, big cities in the United States, where they had buildings where there had been ethnic cleansing, and that the people could put those buildings to use by helping young people get started as families, like an incubator for a family. Because people at that stage, they need help. I needed help when I was starting a family. I didn't have any money, didn't have a job. You have children, you have all these responsibilities, and you need someone out there to help you out. The parish could be the incubator for this because you're like-minded people there, new people coming in, they could do that. The problem here is that we live in a culture that has deliberately destroyed every single intermediary structure that they cannot control. That is a simple fact of life. Okay, the culture is so intrusive. They know so much about you. They are so involved in your business that anytime 2 or 3 people get together, one of those 3 people will be an FBI agent who's trying to break up what you're doing. This is, I saw it personally, obviously, if it's perceived as a political threat, which is precisely what Occupy Wall Street was. It was perceived as a threat because this was 20-year-olds who were objecting to the fact that they had huge amounts of student debt and couldn't get decent jobs. And so I personally witnessed it. I'm sure that of the 5 people I tried to talk to in South Bend, Indiana, at the Occupy Wall Street encampment in South Bend, Indiana, I'm positive 2 of them were FBI agents whose job was simply to make any conversation impossible, because that is the essence of psychological warfare, to prohibit unauthorized communication between subject peoples. That's what psychological warfare is. If you have the parish, you have a head start on this because you have an umbrella or a protective shield that allows conversation. The government is not going to take on the Catholic Church in this regard, in this way. They're not going to send FBI agents into the Catholic Church. A lot of those FBI agents are Catholics themselves. It won't work. The days of Campion and being drawn and quartered for the entertainment of Elizabethan yabos is over. Okay, we have much more sophisticated means, and I'm saying this is one way to avoid that type of systematic disruption known as psychological warfare.
In fact, that leads me on to a question that I had, and because of the position I find myself in, because I've realised that the culture at large is hostile to, genuine Catholicism. Promoting those views in public is, it makes you anathema to the larger culture. And so therefore I've realised that I need to create independent streams of revenue, and so have many other men, like within my community. They've realised that they have to create independent streams of revenue. And I've seen that you've done that very successfully, and I was wondering how you went about doing it and what you'd recommend having, gone through that.
I recommend getting fired from your job, okay? Because that's what got me started in publishing. I was a professor. I was hired as a professor of American literature at St. Mary's College. I wrote articles against abortion when I was employed by a Catholic college, and the feminists who had taken over the college got me fired. So this was a bad thing. because I moved my family out here. I had 2 children at the time, had bought a house, had a mortgage, and so on and so forth. And now I had no means of livelihood. And that's how I started the magazine. I had no idea of what was involved in doing a magazine because I'd never done it before. The only job I was qualified for was the one I just gotten fired from. At this point, you need what is called faith, because your mind simply cannot comprehend the dynamics of what is happening to you, because the fulfillment of those dynamics can only come in the future. And you do not know the future at all. You do not know it. So 9 months after I got fired, I was given the opportunity to start the magazine. And at that point, I started to understand in an inchoate way the way God works in history, which is basically he takes evil and turns it into good, which is what he did to Joseph. You read the story of Joseph and his brothers in the Bible. That's what Joseph says. The evil you intended to do to me has been turned by God's power into good.
Yeah.
So if you do not have faith, you will be risk averse. And if you're not willing to engage in risky behavior, you don't deserve a return on your investment. One of the key concepts of barren metal is you have to share risk. You have to be willing to engage in risk. And if you want to have money and you want to invest it with someone, you only deserve a return if you're willing to share risk, which is also what happened in the Bible. The talents were distributed, and one guy, they all risked it except one guy who got the least talent, and he was criticized for not risking his boss's money. It seems paradoxical, but that's what life is like. So how are you going to be willing and capable to do risk? Only if you have faith. Only if you have faith that there is some type of big ultimate reality out there that is guiding your life, even to the smallest details. And this ultimate reality is so powerful that it can overcome evil in ways that you can't understand. That's what makes you a person who is willing to take on life, who is willing to get involved in the battle of life and take risks and basically come up with something worthwhile. You can't get away from it. And so what you have is a world where you're timid, is a world where you just want to work for someone and be a slave. And as a result, you end up being an unhappy person.
So basically what you're saying is that we need to understand, the light came into the world and the darkness did not comprehend it. We need to understand that God guides this. The Lord hath given and he hath taken away, but ultimately he brings good from that bad. And that's
what we call it, divine providence. So in terms of the book that I'm writing, which I've just finished, by the way.
Oh, awesome. I'm going to buy that. Logos,
yes,
isn't it? History Logos.
Tell all your friends to buy it too. But in terms of that history, we had Greeks who understood that there was a plan for the universe, because every intelligent person can see that there's order somehow in this universe. It's complex order, but it's order. But with Christianity, when St. John said, and Logos is God, it's not just there's an order, there's a power behind that order that is going to impose that order no matter what. And the what we're talking about is evil. Obviously, God cannot will evil, but man, because he's been given free will, can choose evil. And we live in a world where so many people have chosen so much evil, you begin to get discouraged. I mean, just look at the situation in the Middle East. I mean, evil upon evil upon evil there. And you think it's a hopeless situation. It's not. It's not, because what you see, if you have the eyes to see, is God's plan being fulfilled even in a situation like that. So, I mean, just to give you one example, the neoconservatives, this Jewish revolutionary movement that took over American foreign policy in 2003 and invaded Iraq and destroyed Saddam Hussein, what was the net result? What did they do? They opened the Middle East for Iran. They created Iran as a world power. Well, that was not their intention, but their intention doesn't have hegemony over reality. There's only one being whose intention has hegemony over reality, and that's God. And this is what God brought about. This is what God brought about. So if he can bring it about there, I've already told you how he brought it about in my life. It's the macrocosm, it's the microcosm. And if you have that understanding, you have confidence because I'm on the right side. I'm on the right side of history, no matter what. Even though it looks dark right now, I know I'm on the right side because I believe in Logos. And history is nothing more than the progressive unfolding of Logos over time.
Yeah, I mean, you see, this is the real benefit that I got from reading the Old Testament prophets. Like, they express particular types that repeat throughout history, and of course, I think it was G.K. Chesterton said, God works in types and, Satan works in dialectics. And you see these repeated throughout time, and of course, as you said, the final story in the book of Genesis, he's thrown in prison and abandoned by his brothers, and yet he raises to be the second most powerful man in Egypt. So that's
the only man who could save Israel.
Mm.
In other words, he had to be sold into Egypt in order to save Israel. It's an even bigger picture, bigger plan. Israel would have starved to death. There would have been no Israel if it hadn't been for the evil that these people had done to them. And in a sense, in my life, everything I've done is the result of some evil that was done to me. Why do I have to talk about the truth? Why did I have to write Libido Dominandi? To explain the evil of sexual liberation. If there were no evil of sexual liberation, that book would not have been written. So you begin to see the role. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that God wills evil. I am not saying that. It's an error. But I'm saying that God allows evil because he understands that a world with evil being overcome by good is better than a world where there's no free will. That's the ultimate decision that God made, and I think it's true.
Yeah, I can certainly see that myself. Just an aside very quickly, you've disconnected the camera on your end. It doesn't matter for the purposes of the interview because I've got editing to do. That's just an aside though. And secondly, yeah, just to let you know. But I noticed you're talking specifically about our labour manifesting into value, and this leads me into a question from Blackjack. And he asks, what is the difference between your understanding of labour theory of value versus that of Karl Marx?
Karl Marx felt that you could derive a price from the amount of labor that goes into a product. That's false. You can't do it. You need a market to get the price. Okay, but that doesn't change the fact that labor is the source of all value. That's why Adam Smith said it, John Locke said it, Pope John Paul II said it. Anyone with any intelligence understands that labor is the source of all value. But Marx's problem was he was a materialist, and in that sense didn't understand that the universe was, in a sense, God's labor. God labored. Remember, it's in the Bible. He labored so hard he had to take a rest on the seventh day. That's proof that it was labor. And this is proof that the universe is, in a sense, God's labor. So the only way you can have value is with labor, okay? But the only way you can reap that labor is by selling it. And in order to sell it, you have to have a market. And this talks, God distributed resources unequally in the earth. So there are certain places, Ricardo goes into this and distorts it, but there's, Portugal is good for growing wine. And you could spend, for example, a lot of labor in Iceland to create a vineyard. And you might succeed for a little bit. There were apparently vineyards in Greenland during the warmer periods on Earth, but you spend a lot of money and you get an inferior product. And so you have to understand what I'm saying here in the context of creation. And that is precisely why Marx could not understand it, because he didn't believe in creation, because he didn't believe in God. So that led him astray, even though he had the right idea.
So speaking of people who explicitly reject Logos, there are many of those in our lives, and of course, our blessed Lord came across them in the Gospel. How exactly would you recommend dealing with them, particularly if they're in a position of power over us?
You have to tell the truth to power. So you're going to be in the position of Jesus Christ before Pilate, right? And you're
Quidest
going.
Veritas, isn't it, or something like that?
He said, I have come to bring the truth, and Pilate says, well, truth? What is truth?
Mm.
That's kind of like the archetypal confrontation between the Logos and political power. And you could say, in a sense, that Jesus Christ lost, but in losing, he conquered. I don't know how to state it any more archetypally than that type of confrontation. So how did Pilate end up? How did the Roman Empire end up? Well, over the long haul, it was Logos that took over the Roman Empire, because it was Jesus Christ, the Logos incarnate, who became, in effect, the religion and soul of the new Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So when you look at the big picture, you understand how it works out better.
Yeah, so in light of this, and acknowledging, of course, that people may reject Logos and we may have to, undergo our own passions and be, in a sense, crucified with our blessed Lord. And of course, in light of what you were saying about the parish, as young Catholics, as young Catholic men who seek to build families, should we prioritise evangelising to non-Catholics or to strengthening the parishes and communities that already exist in their faith?
I think that's a false dichotomy. I think that if you have a strong parish and you show up at the pub on a Friday evening, you'll be the smartest guy in the room. When they have the pub quiz, you'll be the smartest guy in the room, and people will be attracted to you because you're so smart, because you have Logos. And there will be a natural form of evangelization, which is better oftentimes than the official form of evangelization. I mean, I was in Strasbourg having dinner, and there's an American there, and he tells me he was just in Bavaria. I said, "Oh, Bavaria, Munich. What were you doing in Munich?" He said, "I was bringing Jesus Christ to the Germans." I said, "You were?" I said, "You're about 1,000 years too late." I mean, this is the type of arrogance that some people have. That was a Protestant kind of missionary who felt that he could walk around.
Imagine my surprise.
Hand out pamphlets. Doesn't even speak the language. Can't even speak German. And you're going to bring Jesus Christ. Do you see that church over there? That's been there longer than the Protestant Reformation. So why don't you wake up and find out what you're doing first? This is the type of arrogance that was projected by the British Empire.
Oh, yes, like we did this a lot. But I also see it with the Mormons as well, because there's quite a large Mormon presence in my town, and they came up to me once and they said, "Have you heard of Jesus?" And then I started telling them about the Church Fathers, and they did not expect that.
No, it's no coincidence that these people are Americans, because America is the world hegemon right now, and you think that you're the smartest guy in the room simply because you're an American, and you start spouting off incredibly stupid rubbish, and you alienate everybody in the room, which is, of course, what is happening with the American Empire. You've got people who are just so arrogant because they have political power that they are alienating the entire world, and this is going to bring about the end of the American Empire. This is God's plan. Donald Trump is part of God's plan to end the American Empire, and he's doing a great job of it.
Yeah, I agree, and in fact I've got a question from Normus Mormus, and he asks specifically about this, because I've noticed that, in a sense, the YouTube sphere is kind of a microcosm of that, and you've got many cults of personality going on within that. And he wanted to ask you what you thought about the danger of developing a cult of personality around you, because obviously you've risen to prominence over the last few years. We in the Catholic community, of course, known about you for a lot longer, but on YouTube you've just rose to prominence, and I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I'm flattered to hear that I'm going to be the object of a cult of personality, but it's not going to happen. I'm too old, first of all, and secondly, I'm not referring you to the wisdom of E. Michael Jones. All I'm doing is explicating the people who went before me. And as I said before, the cutting edge of Logos is the Catholic Church. It's not E. Michael Jones. E. Michael Jones, insofar as he is a Catholic, participates in that Logos and the forward movement of Logos. So I'm not referring you to come to join my Jonestown in South Bend, Indiana. I'm not doing that. I'm telling people, if what I say makes sense to you, there's one direction you should take, and that is toward the Logos, the vehicle of Logos, which is the Catholic Church. So if you're not baptized, get baptized. If you are a baptized Catholic, go back and go to confession. And if you're in your 20s, use this momentum to find someone of the opposite sex and get married and start a real life of your own. That's not cult behavior as far as I know.
Thank goodness. It's just there are other Christian people, who've done similar things. I'm thinking specifically of a man whose name rhymes with crier. But this actually leads into a Catholic cult that somebody asked about. Unfortunately, I didn't get down your name, sorry. You've talked a lot about the apparitions at Medjugorje and the inconsistencies and things like that, which I think are very evident. I'm surprised anybody really gives them much credence. But this particular person asked what your opinions were on the other more recent apparitions, so Tre Fontane, Kiberno in, I want to say, Rwanda, and Akita in Japan.
Okay, I have to make a confession here. After I wrote the book on Medjugorje, I pretty much burned out on private revelation. So all I can say is I was conversant about what happened up to that point. I had been to Fatima. I consider Fatima genuine. I had an intense spiritual experience at Fatima, which I think prepared me to write the Medjugorje book. And at Medjugorje, I just kind of checked out of rating private revelation. I don't do it anymore. I'm not familiar with any of the things that you mentioned. There's Thomas Aquinas said that there are two kinds of people out there. There are people who are signs and wonders people, and there are people who are, in effect, Logos people. And one of the most famous signs and wonders guys was St. Paul, who basically had mystical experiences, got knocked off his horse.
The road to Damascus, yeah.
I've fallen off my bicycle a number of times. I never found anything spiritual about it. Okay? I have taken, by writing the Logos book, I have taken the other track, which I find epitomized by St. John. I think they knew each other. I think that they were both in Ephesus together. And I think that St. John wrote the prologue to his gospel with Paul's failure at the Areopagus in mind. Because Paul was used to talking to a Jewish audience, and he's, the Jewish approach is St. Matthew, where you give a genealogy of Jesus. Well, the Greeks don't know who these people are. They don't really care who begat who. And so St. John, knowing this because he was in Ephesus, which is a Greek colony, he wrote a philosophical, metaphysical introduction. And I'm saying, I think that's, I'm not trying to deny that God works miracles and intervenes personally in people's lives. I'm just trying to point out there are dangers to that. And Medjugorje is the classic example of the danger of that, because as St. John of the Cross said, the devil rejoices when people seek private revelations. Why does the devil rejoice? Because he can fake private revelations very easily. And he does it on a daily basis at Medjugorje, which is a place that is infested with evil spirits, demons.
Yeah.
And so why are people going there? Well, because the church is in a sad state. That's the problem. Because the parish has been wrecked, because Catholic culture has been uprooted by psychological warfare. The bishops don't know what happened. They're kind of groping around in the dark. And so people saying, I've had it. I'm going straight to the top. I'm going to the Blessed Mother. I want to talk to the guy who's in charge here. Well, that's not the way it works, and what you're seeing here is the human dissatisfaction with living according to faith. Faith is in things unseen. Faith means putting up with uncertainty in dark moments. As I mentioned, in my own life, everyone's had these moments in life. And some people find it intolerable, especially when there's a vacuum of authority in the Catholic Church. And so they go to apparitions. And the devil knows that. And the devil will give you your phony apparition. And you don't have to worry about it. You plunk the money down, you will have something happen. I guarantee it. That's what Medjugorje is all about.
Yeah, like I've observed actually, there are a lot of cults around Our Lady of Fatima, especially, where, like, of course, huge miracle in Fatima, Portugal, but it's led to the creation of a number of cults, particularly Sede Vacantis cults, and these are of course causing problems because they're essentially new Protestant denominations. And I entirely agree with you. I think that especially with private revelation. I can't
And
remember.
if that's the case with Fatima, which is genuine, you can imagine what the case is with Medjugorje, which is as phony as a $3 bill, as we say over here.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have bizarre spiritual experiences. I've had them, and it takes a level of discernment that most people kind of lack. I know that for certain. I recall I know a lot of Protestants who have their spiritual experiences, and they all seem very off. I'm going off of what I read from St. Athanasius of Alexandria in his hagiography of Saint Anthony of the Desert, Saint Anthony the Great, and I just think that they should generally be tuned out. I'm glad that we can be of two minds on this. So anyway, we've hit about the hour point. I was wondering if you had any final words, any sort of perhaps a gestalt of the whole discussion we've just had, like anything you'd offer.
Logos is rising. We are seeing the development of a new era of consciousness, especially among the 20-year-olds right now. And that is the movement of God in history. It's consciousness. And once you have a certain consciousness, you can't go back. And I'm saying that this consciousness is not just some type of vapor out there. It is the movement of God in history. It seems very fragile, but it's more powerful than any of the evils or any of the weapons that this culture can put up against it.
Deo gracias. Thank you very much for coming on, Dr. Jones. It's been a real honour having you on here.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully you'll see my video tomorrow. Goodbye. A very big thank you to those on the list here. These are subscribers to the Renaissance Man program who get audio books and controversial videos every week for $5 a month. There's already quite a lot of content there, so if you check it out in the description, you won't be missing out. Thank you.